In March of 2020, I recall the unease I felt as the first measures were put in place to halt the progression of the COVID-19 virus. I had the distinct thought that things were bound to go one of two ways. Either this was the literal beginning of the end of the world, or it would be a temporary inconvenience ushering forth a rather boring apocalypse to sit through. Either way, I was certain that no matter what happened, the world would never be the same. Although the specifics for that are better left to a conversation in another place and time. I was one of the lucky ones. My life didn't change too much, other than having a few somewhat controversial mandates to follow, on top of the fact that toilet paper had become a scarce and highly sought-after commodity. The apocalypse I dreamed of was met with a reality that was uncomfortable but otherwise mundane. With nothing but free time on my hands, I sought an escape from the boring day-to-day in the form of apocalyptic media. Nothing satisfied my craving for apocalyptic adventure, as did Tom Clancy's The Division. The Division is a game that explores the theme of urban survival as law and order are combated against the upheaval of total anarchy. The game is set in a near-future New York City, where a deadly virus has been unleashed on Black Friday, causing a massive pandemic that kills millions and plunges the city into absolute mayhem. The player assumes the role of a special agent of the Strategic Homeland Division, or simply, the Division, a secret organization that is activated to restore order and investigate the source of the outbreak. The game features an open-world design allowing the player to explore the city, engage in firefights with various enemy factions, and cooperate or compete with other players in the Dark Zone, a quarantined area where the virus is most active and valuable loot can be found. The Division is a game that offers an immersive and compelling experience of what it would be like to survive in a city ravaged by a biological disaster. It presents a realistic and detailed depiction of New York City, capturing its iconic landmarks, diverse neighborhoods, and cultural atmosphere. The game also creates a sense of tension and danger by showing the effects of the virus on the city's population, infrastructure, and environment. The game had me questioning what I would do in such a situation. How could I possibly cope with the loss of society and civilization? And how would I balance my own personal interests with my greater duty to humanity? The Division also reflects on the fragility of our modern world, where a single event can trigger a chain reaction of chaos and destruction. It examines the role of authority and leadership in times of crisis, as well as the nature of human behavior and psychology under extreme conditions. Upon its conclusion, it ultimately invites players to consider what it means to be human in a world that has lost its humanity. I'll be comparing my own apocalyptic work with The Division, since they both take place in a similar urban environment, but have wildly different events that resulted in societal collapse. The key difference between the two is the setup pre-collapse as well as the cause itself. The greatest source of inspiration the game gave me actually came in the form of the companion novel, New York Collapse. The book itself is part merchandise and part well-written apocalyptic media. On its own, the novel is a rather interesting read. The book itself is a guide to surviving in an urban environment during a massive disaster situation. Overlaid over the printed text in the book are handwritten notes from a character in the world of The Division. Half survival guide, half personal diary entries, 100% well worth having, be it on a coffee table or sitting on the toilet for the occasional flip through the pages. Praise of the merchandise meant for die-hard fans of the game aside, survival in an urban landscape, as depicted in The Division, is hellish at best. Typically, when we experience an apocalyptic setting in media, it is either during the event that brings forth the end of civilization, or sometime after, in which case the dust of complete social chaos has begun to settle. The Division places itself right in the midst of turmoil merely a few months after the virus was unleashed upon humanity. The player is introduced to the world at such an opportune time. Enough disaster is taking place to completely upend modern living, yet there is still a wealth of people around not yet having succumbed to the fractured state of the world. There are just the right amount of warring factions left to make living in a collapsed New York City a nightmare. While writing my own novels, I source inspiration wherever I just so happen to find it. In the Shelter series, the United States government had established a contingency plan if the country were to ever fall into a state of ruin due to an unforeseen collapse. The Shelter Initiative was structured to give America a fighting chance to claw its way out of utter annihilation. Several key regions were established to be maintained while the rest of the country was left to fend for itself. These major cities were critical to the long-term goal of reestablishing law and order and bringing the country back together. Much as in The Division, an organization was created to ensure that in a widespread horrific scenario that marked the end of the civilized world, there would be a dedicated team with a plan of action in place to pick up the pieces of a ruined country. In the Shelter series, the fall of civilization was due to rapid hyperinflation with the disappearance of all cryptocurrencies in the world where fiat currency had been phased out. The first novel of Shelter takes place a year after the event known as the Reset that led to global economic collapse. Taking place in the divided Shelter city of Chicago, enough time has passed for two dominant groups to take hold of the city while smaller factions bend to one side or the other. The follow-up novel, The Reset, acts as an extended prequel, showcasing the larger world from before the Standards Workplace and Wages Act was signed into law, all the way until chronologically Shelter's climax takes place. In The Reset, we experience the before, during, and after the apocalyptic event, the majority of which is centered outside of major cities. Shelter is designed as a slow burn apocalypse, whereas in The Division things happen suddenly. The world in Shelter was in a state of economic decline for many years. With the United States remaining a holdout in the global conversion to cryptocurrency, world markets had adjusted to trend buying power away from the United States dollar. To counteract the ill effects of having a diminishing currency as inflation drove prices of goods and services to unreasonable levels, the U.S. government enacted the Standards Workplace and Wages Act. It aimed at increasing the minimum wage and providing a wealth of benefits to employees. This portion of the act was designed only to gain public favor among citizens. The broad-scale version of the act was to force corporations to bring more jobs back to the U.S., as any American-based company working with an entity outside of the U.S. was required to provide the same benefits from the top down. Incentivize people to work in the U.S. to strengthen the USD or be punished for contributing to the economic strength of foreign nations. On paper, it was seen as a solid plan. However, corporations did what they do best. They found a loophole. The act only pertained to employees, so rather than attempt to remain in compliance with the act, many companies made a transition of their own, to have independent contractors instead of employees. This would allow them to legally circumvent the act entirely, while at the same time drastically increasing their profit margins. So the stage was set for the powder keg to ignite years later once the reset happened and all the cryptocurrency in the world vanished without rhyme nor reason. Domestically, the US was already hanging by a thread, with millions of people rightfully angry for the years of hyperinflation and poor pay, all due to the hubris of our government not wanting to abandon the dollar and follow the same change as the rest of the world. For The Division, aside from the setup of the green poison, the world was operating as usual. Until the pandemic hit, there was hardly anything amiss, be it political or economic strife outside of our own timeline in the real world. This foundation had an established stability that would allow a sudden event like the rapid spread of a virus with a high mortality rate to completely steamroll throughout the country. Green poison, or the dollar flu as it's called, was spread through banknotes and released to the masses on Black Friday, which in the US is the biggest shopping day of the year, during a season that is the most prone for the spread of viral infections, all on top of being let loose in one of the most densely populated places on the planet. All of this tied together makes the unleashing of the green poison so cataclysmic. The perfect string of timing, deployment mechanism, and location to yield the greatest amount of destruction possible. I pointed all this out specifically to give context to the state of the world once the apocalypse hits. In The Division, we see miles of stagnant perpetual traffic as abandoned cars litter the roads. Whereas in Shelter, gas had become such an expensive commodity that up until the reset, cars became too expensive to operate for most people. This is why the streets of Chicago resemble pure abandonment rather than the echoes of a drawn-out disaster. As evident in the game, many locations show how society functioned at the early onset of the pandemic. With the virus spreading so rapidly, entire buildings had to be quarantined, then blocks, and eventually entire city neighborhoods. The largest section of New York that is held under quarantine is an area known as the Dark Zone. The entire middle section of the map is closed off, removed from the rest of the city, as it has been deemed beyond saving by both the JTF and the Division. This act of amputating an infected foot to save the leg was the most logical given the severity of the virus. A grim yet appropriate segregation in many stories of pandemics, a hard yet necessary action. The TV show Containment, the very same thing happens to a section of the city of Atlanta, although the specifics on that are best saved for another time. In between, we see a small town cut off from the outside world due to an unknown disease or another entity that kills anyone at or above the age of 22. Yet they all share quite a lot in common from different perspectives. Only in Shelter do we see a city cutting off a part of itself to save itself from itself for reasons other than a virus. Chicago was a city under the Shelter Initiative, which meant that they were in direct connection with the only other functioning regions in the country. As the state attempted to establish complete law and control to allow the city as a whole to survive, too many people outright refused to listen to reason, as they only cared about the immediacy of their own survival. By the north part of Chicago, removing itself and its aid from the southern half of the city, they were able to successfully establish and maintain their half of the city under the Shelter Initiative. Had they not done this, sooner rather than later, the chaotic disorder from the south side would have turned the city to ash. Those in the Division operated the same way. Those in charge sacrificed a part of the city to save themselves, sealing away those that were already doomed. The Division provides an interesting snapshot at one of the most critical times following an apocalyptic event, the relatively immediate aftermath. The Division depicts a dystopian scenario where a deadly virus known as the dollar flu, or green poison, has decimated New York City and triggered a nationwide crisis. The virus was engineered by a rogue virologist, Dr. Gordon Amherst, who wanted to reduce the human population and restore the natural balance of the planet. He infected banknotes with a modified strain of smallpox and distributed them on Black Friday, the busiest shopping day of the year. The virus spread rapidly through contact and aerosols, killing 90% of those infected and leaving behind a city in chaos. The dollar flu virus is a crimea, meaning it is composed of genetic material from different sources. According to the game's lore, Dr. Amherst used a digital synthesizer to create hundreds of variations of the virus, combining elements from smallpox, Ebola, H1N1, dengue fever, and a few other pathogens. He also added a gene that made the virus resistant to existing vaccines and treatments. The idea of creating a synthetic virus is not far-fetched. In fact, scientists have already done it for research purposes. For example, in 2002, researchers at the State University of New York at Stony Brook recreated the poliovirus from scratch using mail-order DNA and published instructions. In 2005, another team at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reconstructed the 1918 Spanish flu virus that killed 50 million people worldwide. These experiments were done to understand how these viruses work and how to prevent or treat them. However, they also raised ethical and security concerns about the potential misuse or accidental release of such viruses. The dollar flu virus is highly contagious and can be transmitted through direct contact with infected people or objects, as well as through respiratory droplets in the air. The game shows how the virus spread through banknotes and were exchanged during Black Friday sales, but also through other means such as subway trains, elevators, phones, keyboards, etc. The transmission mode of the dollar flu virus is similar to that of many real-life respiratory viruses, such as influenza, SARS, or measles. These viruses can survive on surfaces for hours or days, depending on the environmental conditions. They can also travel through the air for several feet or meters, especially when people cough or sneeze. This makes them very hard to contain and control. Dollar flu virus has a 7-day incubation period, during which the infected person shows no signs of illness but can still infect others. After that, the person develops flu-like symptoms such as fever, headache, fatigue, cough, and muscle pain. These symptoms are followed by a rash that covers the whole body, and blisters that form in the mouth and throat. The blisters eventually burst and bleed, causing severe pain and difficulty breathing. Most people die within a few days from organ failure or secondary infections. The symptoms of the dollar flu virus are based on those of smallpox, one of the most deadly diseases in human history. Smallpox was eradicated in 1980 thanks to a global vaccination campaign led by the World Health Organization. However, some samples of the virus are still stored in laboratories for research purposes. There is also a possibility that some rogue actors may have access to the virus and use it as a bioweapon. The dollar flu virus has a devastating impact on New York City and beyond. It kills millions of people in a matter of weeks, overwhelming hospitals and morgues. It causes social unrest and breakdown of law and order. Looting, rioting, violence, and crime have become rampant. Some groups try to take advantage of the situation by seizing power or resources. Others try to help or protect their communities by forming militias or factions. The government activates a secret unit called the Division, composed of sleeper agents who are trained to restore order and find a cure for the virus. In a post-apocalyptic story, the state of the world is dictated upon three main factors that all lead back to the apocalyptic event itself: the fatality rate of the event, the time we find our characters after the event, the number of surviving people in a given area. Urban settings offer the highest risk and greatest reward, both of which are entirely contingent upon the results of the aforementioned conditions people find themselves within that location. Metropolitan areas are designed to house hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in a relatively small footprint. Densely populated areas become fortresses, housing tons of resources post-collapse. From food and water to medicine and adequate shelter, urban settings offer those who survived an apocalyptic event a clear-cut advantage in terms of raw resources that are necessary to continue living. The risk comes from not being the only survivor in that location. Factoring in the cause of the event and how many people are left after allows the scales to tip in terms of how many resources are actually left for people to use. A surplus in resources matched with very few people around means a lower risk and high reward. Infighting should be minimal when there is an abundance of supply. Whereas with a larger population struggling to survive, the amount of goods to be split between everyone will only get lower, increasing a demand that can never be fulfilled in the same timely manner back when the world was operating business as usual. Well, on paper, this idea makes sense. In practice, human nature tends to complicate even the most balanced systems. In the Division, the high mortality rate of the virus meant that there were very few people left in New York to compete with, while the swiftness of the pandemic allowed for many of the resources remaining in the city to be left unused. Fewer people, less competition, a decent amount of food, water, and medicine to go around, not to mention an entire city open for people to establish shelter wherever they pleased, sounds like a heavenly spot in a hellish world. The best place to be given the circumstances. However, when facing a world-ending event, one cannot assume that everyone will share a utilitarian mindset. A catastrophic collapse really does mean that everyone is out for themselves and their own best interests. Should I share this warehouse of food with other survivors in the area, or keep the location a secret to ensure my own group remains well fed? For an individual, these moral quandaries can greatly burden the soul, but for groups, it is almost a certainty that they will use any edge for survival wherever they can. For an individual to lower their overall exposure and risk, finding a like-minded group is just as important as finding supplies. Widespread, this will quickly lead to tribalism. Bands of groups that, although carry similar goals, believe in different methods to attain the same outcome. Longevity in a dangerous environment. The division greatly emphasizes an apocalyptic display of tribalism with its several factions warring with each other in the city. Although narratively this is just to give a push of enemy variety for gameplay purposes, the idea of society falling into tribal groups is appropriately represented while allowing the moment-to-moment cover-based shooter gameplay to take center stage. The different groups vying for power and control in the division are as follows. The Strategic Homeland Division is a decentralized, autonomous entity endowed with executive powers and rules of engagement unfettered by legal constraints. Trained to operate in deadly chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear environments, the division is mandated to bring order, stability, and justice to communities shattered by catastrophic events. The agency also pledges active support to classified continuity of government plans, should a widespread national disaster cripple normal governing functions. The Joint Task Force is the thin line of first responders holding back chaos in Manhattan. Comprised of firemen, police officers, city workers, and more, the JTF works to protect citizens and the city itself. Outnumbered and outgunned, they work with the division to try to take back the city. A banded group of sanitation workers, the cleaners have a singular mission: to completely eradicate the virus in the most reckless way possible, with fire. Attracted to areas of high contamination, the cleaners will indiscriminately burn anything and anyone that has the possibility to be contaminated. Their actions are the eventual display of ending the pandemic by any means necessary. Newly escaped prisoners from Rikers Island seek only to relish the pure chaos brought forth by the pandemic. As the city lays in wreckage, they aim to take what they want from who they want as violently as possible. Having been locked behind bars for so long, the new post-collapse New York landscape is ripe for the plunder. The Last Man Battalion I find to be the most compelling faction in the game, strictly from a lore perspective. Composed of a professional private security force, they were tasked to secure and protect corporate assets. Once the quarantine was put in place, they abandoned their clients and re-aimed their attention at the security of their own group, and eventually felt that they were the only ones with the means to secure the city. When facing a disaster of any magnitude, affluent individuals, those in positions of power, and wealthy corporations will have the means necessary to hire or assign a private security force to help them survive. It is only a matter of time before those same people are left to fend for themselves as their private military forces abandon them. The agreements of protection made in the old world mean very little when the world is ending. As the scale of devastation increases, people will gravitate towards whatever means of survival is best suited for them, even if it means breaking established deals brokered prior. Even the once wealthy will face the same challenges as everyone else. The interconnected systems that allow a plethora of conveniences granted in our modern world will start to break down. Power, if still functional, will flicker and become unreliable, just as running water and gas lines will begin to falter. The more time we find ourselves away from the event, the less likely these systems will be in place for survivors to utilize. A total system collapse can be tricky to contemplate, but the concept is rather straightforward. In a modern society, goods and services are intrinsically linked to one another. The recent supply chain shortages that happened due to COVID-19 give a great insight to the tipping balances of these systems, although it could also be an intentional manipulation to decrease supply while encouraging demand. I believe the most appropriate example for this essay is a quote from my own novel, The Reset.
The Shelter Initiative was a government plan to maintain law and order in the event of an economic collapse. Several high-ranking government officials would be set to oversee key regions in the U.S., most notably areas predicted to be hit hardest, major cities. Officials would govern these regions and establish supply lines while maintaining infrastructure connecting each region. Surviving citizens would have to forego their entire way of living to have the faintest attempt to stabilize any region in the U.S. What were once simple amenities would turn into a lavish luxury. To clarify, imagine a simple roll of toilet paper. It can easily be ignored, but the value a single roll has is massive. When society faces a collapse, the pillars that lift it up also face a ruination. For a roll of toilet paper to be manufactured, packaged, and then delivered from the factories would be a massive undertaking. Once society has collapsed, so too do the means of production for tens of thousands of goods. Trees need to be grown and harvested at the right moment to craft lumber. Whatever scraps remain can be used for paper milling. Before even starting the paper-making process, we've hit a snag. Should these scraps be shredded and broken into a pulpy mass just to yield out a few rolls of toilet paper? Or should the scraps be better given to a team trying to manufacture medical supplies? The logistics involved in making a single roll of toilet paper are just not possible on a large scale in a post-collapse society, and the masses will understand this notion very quickly. Without structures upholding the rule of law in place, panic and disorder will overwhelm the nation and cripple any hopes of maintaining a functioning civilization. Common hygiene supplies will become a finite luxury people will kill over. This disorder, this chaos, cannot be avoided, but knowing what grim reality lies ahead, we can organize in advance.
Although the plot of the game is structured to push the moment-to-moment gameplay, I found the dense world building fascinating. The virus being initially transmitted through banknotes during the busiest shopping day of the year is a rather poetic glimpse into the consumer mindset. We've become so comfortable in an era of advanced technology where products, services, and information are right at our fingertips. This comfortability has granted innate levels of greed within us. This greed goes unchecked, as many of us don't even recognize our own entitlement, as this standard of living has become the norm. Greed is embedded in us from such a young age that we never bother to question the privileges we have. Cash was always king, until it turned into a merchant of death. The green poison was able to run rampant due to precise social engineering, not of its own accord, but through that of our own. Shopping has always been pushed on Americans to procure purchases without abandon, all just to feel a spike of dopamine. The virus might have been the blade, but our own nature held the knife. More telling than the virus itself, the very title of the series places the greatest foe in bold font: division. When disaster strikes and the world begins to die, fight or flight will kick in, resulting in what remains of mankind to stand divided. In The Division, the entire city of New York is vying for power. In Shelter, we witness a city cut itself in two, each half with distinct cultures and mindsets, but ultimately share the same goal with opposing methods: survival, no matter the cost. The most terrifying part of facing the end of the world is the division. If we are not surviving alone, then who remains for our survival to contend against? What threat is present to stand vigilant against? A divided humanity facing the end of days turns the whole world into a dark forest. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I would greatly appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribed. If you want to help me hone my craft of writing, I would love to engage with you in the comments. Criticism and suggestions would be most welcome, as it is the best way for me to develop my skills as a writer. If you have any ideas for upcoming videos, please share them with me. The best place to reach and engage with me is on my Discord server. The link, of course, is down below. If you're interested in listening to my audiobooks, The Reset and Shelter Part 1, for free, or even purchasing a physical copy for your own collection, all those links will be in the description as well. Thank you so much again. This really honestly does mean the world to me. This is what I love to do, and I love being able to engage with people that, are into the same kind of end of the world stuff as me. I know it's strange. I don't really understand it myself, but I am obsessed with thoughts of different ways that the world could just utterly be destroyed. I don't know. It's a good time. Anyway, as always, I am your oh so glorious beloved Mace Valor, signing off.